Summer 1943. The heat lay heavy over the hills of Tennessee, but inside Camp Crossville, the moment that truly burned itself into memory was not the sun, nor the dust, nor the distant clank of guards' boots on gravel. It was the fizz, the faint hiss of bubbles rising through dark caramel liquid in a glass bottle, cold to the touch, even on a sweltering day. For one German prisoner of war, freshly transported from the deserts of North Africa, that sound was as alien as the landscape itself. He lifted the bottle, brought it to his lips, and tasted something that seemed impossible: Coca-Cola. This soldier had spent 2 years under Rommel's command, marching and fighting across harsh desert terrain, sustained only by the barest rations hardtack biscuits, ersatz coffee, and the endless thirst of a soldier's canteen. Yet here, in captivity, his first days in America confronted him with a drink so sweet, so effervescent, so unnecessary that it felt like tasting another planet. The bottle cost just 5 cents from the camp canteen. The guards told him the same price that American children paid from their allowances. For a man whose homeland rationed sugar so severely that many German children had never tasted a candy bar, this single bottle cracked open a new reality. Across hundreds of prison camps spread across the United States that summer, more than 370,000 captured German soldiers confronted similar shocks. They arrived hardened by war, their minds drilled with propaganda that painted Americans as weak, decadent, and incapable of sacrifice. Nazi officers had warned them that capture meant brutality, starvation, and humiliation. But in camp after camp, their senses betrayed them. Instead of cruelty, they encountered abundance. Ice cream scoops handed out as routine dessert, candy bars sold at the price of a nickel. Not as rare luxuries, but as everyday snacks. Soft drinks lined up in rows, offered casually, consumed without ceremony. To men conditioned by scarcity, this was more than indulgence. It was revelation. The mathematics of abundance, written in sugar and carbonation, chocolate and cream, dismantled their old convictions more effectively than Allied propaganda leaflets ever could. The German High Command had preached that deprivation was noble sacrifice, proof of national strength. Yet here was a nation so wealthy it could feed prisoners better than many German families ate at home. It was a contradiction too stark to ignore. The amazement that began with a single sip of Coca-Cola was only the first step in a longer journey. Within weeks, many German POWs began to see captivity not as punishment but as an education. They watched American guards toss away half-empty bottles of soda without a thought, while in Germany a single sugar cube was treasured. They observed children licking ice cream cones on school playgrounds, while back home German children lined up for watery soup. Every small act of casual plenty challenged their worldview. What stunned them most was not just the existence of these luxuries, but the normalcy of them. In Germany, chocolate bars or ice cream sundaes were rare treasures even in the best years before the war, confined to those with money or privilege. In America, they seemed woven into the very fabric of daily life available at diners, camp canteens, school cafeterias, and even on troop ships crossing the Atlantic. The message was clear: abundance here was not a privilege. It was a birthright of democracy. Historians like Arnold Kramer would later note that this cultural encounter did something Allied leaflets never managed. It struck at the core of Nazi ideology. German superiority had been built on the premise that enemies were weak, soft, and incapable of sustaining the rigors of war. Yet these soft Americans produced liberty ships by the hundreds, bombers by the thousands, and still had enough left over to waste ice cream on their prisoners. Strength. The POWs realized, was not in austerity. It was in abundance. By the end of that summer, many German prisoners spoke openly of their confusion. Letters heavily censored but still revealing showed them writing home about Coca-Cola, chocolate, and the generosity of American civilians. For some, the shock tasted literally sweet. For others, it was bitter with the realization that they had been lied to. One officer later recalled to the International Red Cross, "We expected to be starved as prisoners. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army had. That was the beginning of our education." The story of German POWs in America is often told through statistics: calories per day, tons of sugar imported, billions of bottles of Coca-Cola bottled in 1943 alone. But to understand its impact, we must begin here, in the personal shock of a single soldier, a man who had endured hunger and fear in the desert, standing in a Tennessee prison camp, marveling at the fizz of soda bubbles and the impossible sweetness of a nickel bottle. In that moment, the war of ideas shifted, and all it took was Coca-Cola. The end came quickly in North Africa. In May 1943, after months of desperate fighting, the once proud Afrika Korps laid down its arms in Tunisia. Rommel was gone, his reputation tarnished, and with him went the last hope of German victory on that continent. Roughly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were rounded up by the Allies in a matter of weeks, men who had once pushed the British to the gates of Egypt, now lined up in dusty columns as prisoners of war. Among these men, anticipation mixed with dread. For years, Nazi propaganda had hammered into their minds a singular message: surrender meant suffering. They were told that the Americans were crude, materialistic, and cruel, that captivity in their hands would mean starvation, humiliation, and slow death. To men hardened by years of privation, these warnings seemed credible. They expected the lash, the hunger pangs, and the slow wasting away that prisoners of war had known in conflicts past. What awaited them instead was pancakes. At the processing camps in North Africa, the U.S. Army did something extraordinary. It fed its enemies. Not just the bare minimum to keep them alive, but meals that, to the exhausted Germans, seemed like feasts. American K rations derided by U.S. soldiers as monotonous and unappetizing were treasures in German eyes. Crackers, processed cheese, candy, fruitbars, instant coffee, sugar tablets, and even cigarettes filled these small cardboard boxes. For men who had marched on minimal rations for months, this was abundance beyond imagining. Accounts from the time describe the astonishment on German faces when the first field rations were handed out. Some POWs tore open the packages in disbelief, convinced it was a trick. But when they bit into chocolate bars and sipped sweet coffee, the truth became undeniable. A German officer later testified to the International Red Cross, "We expected to be starved as prisoners. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army had." At these initial processing stations, the astonishment only deepened. Military records confirm that in addition to emergency rations, the U.S. Army served pancakes with syrup, fresh eggs, and cold milk. To Americans, these foods were routine breakfast fare. To Germans, they were relics of a vanished world. Fresh eggs had been absent from military rations for years. Syrup was unheard of. And milk, precious milk, was something German families rationed drop by drop. Here, Their enemy poured it freely into tin cups. The impact was profound and immediate. Within hours of surrender, men who had steeled themselves for cruelty encountered instead generosity. Confusion spread among the ranks. Was this some form of psychological warfare, a trick to soften them before harsher realities set in? Yet the pancakes, the eggs, the syrup, and the milk were no illusion. They were simply America being America. For the German prisoners, the experience was transformative. They had been taught that America was a chaotic nation of mongrels, incapable of discipline or endurance. Instead, they saw organization, efficiency, and abundance. Trucks lined up with supplies. Mess halls operated with military precision. Food appeared on time, hot and plentiful. What struck them most was not only the volume of food, but its quality. In the German army, bread grew ever coarser, made with fillers to stretch dwindling supplies. Meat shrank to slivers, sugar to crystals doled out carefully. But here, even prisoners of war ate meals that German civilians back home could scarcely dream of. The shock of those first days cannot be overstated. German ideology prized suffering as a badge of honor, sacrifice as proof of superiority. Yet, in the first encounters with American rations, that ideology began to unravel. These men discovered that their enemies possessed not only overwhelming military might, but also a capacity for generosity that contradicted everything they had been told. Historians have since noted how critical these first meals were in reshaping perceptions. The shock of abundance worked on a psychological level deeper than any leaflet or lecture. A man who bites into a candy bar he has never seen before cannot easily dismiss it as propaganda. A soldier sipping sweet coffee under a foreign sun knows in his gut that his old beliefs no longer match reality. The Germans captured in Tunisia carried these memories with them across the Atlantic. As they boarded ships for the long journey to America, their bellies were fuller than they had been in months, and in their minds, questions began to form. If the enemy could feed them better than their own army, what else had the Reich lied about? The seeds of doubt had been planted, not by force of arms, but by pancakes and syrup. The journey across the Atlantic was meant to be grim. In the minds of the German prisoners, the ocean crossing symbolized exile, defeat, and the unknown. They expected misery, cramped holds, stale bread, watery soup, and sickness from weeks at sea. But as they boarded the towering grey silhouettes of Liberty ships in the summer of 1943, they stepped instead into another paradox of American power, abundance in motion. These Liberty ships were not elegant vessels. They were practical, functional, and mass-produced on a scale the world had never seen. American shipyards could build one in as little as 42 days. At peak production, a completed vessel slid into the water every 42 hours. By themselves, these numbers spoke volumes to German engineers who boarded them as captives. They had been told that America was chaotic, disorganized, incapable of discipline, yet here were stale giants, rolling out of factories like automobiles, each one capable of carrying thousands of men or mountains of supplies across treacherous seas. For the prisoners, the revelation was not just in the ship's existence, but in what they carried food. Naval records show that prisoner rations on these vessels matched, and sometimes even exceeded, those of the American crews. Each man received approximately 500 calories a day. Meals included fresh bread, meat, vegetables, and perhaps most astonishing of all, coffee with sugar and milk. For Germans used to ersatz substitutes and bitter, rationed brews, The sweetness of real coffee was a sensory jolt. But the true marvel came cold and frozen. Ice cream. The first time a batch appeared, confusion rippled through the prisoner ranks. Was this a mistake? Was it really possible that their captors would serve frozen dessert in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from shore? Yet the proof lay before them, in scoops of chocolate and vanilla, cool and sweet against their tongues. On the 4th of July, 1943, the USS General M.B. Stewart celebrated American Independence Day by serving ice cream to its prisoners. The ship's logbook notes that its onboard ice cream maker produced 10 gallons at a time, enough for both crew and captives alike. The symbolism was inescapable. At a moment when Germany was tightening belts, rationing sugar, and cutting meat from civilian diets, here was America, a nation at war on two fronts, offering ice cream at sea. Prisoners, who had not seen such a dessert since before the war, stared at their bowls in disbelief. For many, the taste was more shocking than the capture itself. Technological detail added to the awe. The ship's refrigeration systems, standard equipment on American vessels, kept fresh food available throughout the voyage. Meat did not spoil, milk did not sour, and vegetables retained their crispness. For technically trained German soldiers, this efficiency challenged deeply ingrained assumptions. They had been told that America was a nation of improvisers, incapable of methodical engineering. Yet here was proof of a system so well designed that fresh food could cross the Atlantic without loss. The voyage itself became an education. On deck, prisoners watched American sailors operate with practiced rhythm, unloading cargo, repairing equipment, and navigating with calm confidence. Below deck, they consumed meals that rivaled what German civilians had not tasted in years. The very act of feeding prisoners so well was its own message. It said, America had so much it could afford to share even with its enemies. When the ships finally docked at ports like Norfolk, Virginia, or Newport News, the shock intensified. These harbours dwarfed German expectations. Norfolk's naval base alone spanned more than 4,000 acres. Its cranes and warehouses unloading more cargo in a single day than many German ports managed in a week. Prisoners disembarking caught glimpses of shop windows stocked with candy, chewing gum, and soft drinks. Shelves groaned with products they had been told did not exist. One POW later recalled his first sight of a port exchange store. There were more candy bars in one shop than I had seen in all of Germany during the war. He wasn't exaggerating. Procurement records from 1943 show that American military exchanges regularly stocked dozens of candy varieties: Hershey, Mars, Nestle, all at the standard 5-cent price. For prisoners who had lived years without sugar, this abundance was unfathomable. The train journeys inland deepened the education. Instead of cattle cars, as used in Europe for prisoner transport, Germans travelled in passenger coaches. Dining cars offered full meals, fried chicken, fresh vegetables, pie, and hot coffee. Once again, they realized this was not special treatment for prisoners. It was simply the way Americans travelled. The message resonated more deeply than any propaganda leaflet could. If America could transport its enemies across the ocean in comfort, feed them ice cream on ships, and give them pie on trains, what did that say about the society behind such choices? For many Germans, the Atlantic crossing was the true turning point. The initial shock of surrender had broken their pride. The journey across an ocean of abundance began reshaping their beliefs. They arrived in America not just as defeated soldiers, but as reluctant witnesses to a civilization whose power lay not only in guns and tanks, but in milk, sugar, refrigeration, and ice cream. When the Liberty ships finally nudged into American harbors, the German prisoners of war braced themselves. They expected warehouses of war material, grim soldiers, and perhaps the hard faces of angry civilians. Instead, the docks of Norfolk, Virginia, and Newport News delivered yet another revelation. The sheer scale of the port operations dwarfed anything they had known in Germany. Towering cranes swung effortlessly overhead, lifting cargo containers with mechanical precision. Endless warehouses lined the waterfront, stacked to the rafters with goods. Rail lines ran directly into the docks, ensuring that trains carried supplies inland as soon as they were unloaded. For men who had come from Europe's rationed, bomb-scarred cities, the activity seemed almost surreal. Norfolk alone, with its 300 acres of facilities, handled more cargo in a single day than major German ports managed in a week. The difference was not merely logistical, it was philosophical. Here was a system designed not for scarcity, but for abundance. The prisoners were herded off their ships under watchful guard. But even in captivity, their eyes took in details that challenged years of propaganda. They saw warehouses filled not only with tanks and trucks, but with crates marked for food, clothing, and consumer goods. They glimpsed advertisements painted on walls for Coca-Cola, Lucky Strike cigarettes, and chewing gum ordinary products, so abundant they could be marketed to the masses. Then came the port exchanges. The PX stores intended for American sailors and dock workers. Through open doors and windows, prisoners caught sight of shelves that seemed to mock the German reality. Stacks of candy bars, Hershey, Mars, Nestlé stood ready for purchase, each at the standard price of 5 cents. Procurement records from 1943 confirm that these stores stocked dozens of varieties, from plain chocolate to peanut-filled confections. For the prisoners, this was more than temptation. It was humiliation. In Germany, sugar was strictly rationed. A single candy bar was a rare treat, reserved for the privileged or black market buyers. Here, in the enemy's land, it was so common that even dockhands bought them by the handful. The impact was not limited to food. Soft drinks filled coolers, their glass bottles gleaming in the summer light. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, names that meant nothing to most Germans before the war, were everywhere. Prisoners quickly realized these were not luxuries for the wealthy. They were everyday beverages consumed by children, workers, and soldiers alike. The uniformity of Coca-Cola's taste astounded them, identical in Norfolk as it was in Tennessee, or so the guards told them. To technically minded Germans, this represented an industrial feat beyond anything their own country had achieved. Standardization on such a scale hinted at a system of production and distribution that seemed almost alien. The abundance extended beyond confections and soda. Newspapers printed daily circulation figures in the millions, filled with advertisements for products that would have seemed fantastical in war-torn Europe. Radio broadcasts flowed through every household, powered by a consumer electronics industry untouched by bombing. Clothing stores displayed racks of garments in multiple sizes and colors, while German families at home were stitching and restitching old uniforms into children's wear. The train journeys inland reinforced these impressions. Instead of being shoved into cattle cars, the Germans were seated in proper passenger coaches. The difference struck them immediately: padded seats, overhead fans, and windows that actually opened. Dining cars served meals that could have come from a restaurant: fried chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, pie, and steaming coffee. To Americans, it was standard rail service. To the prisoners, it was almost obscene luxury. Some whispered among themselves that this must be part of a propaganda trick. But when guards explained casually that this was just normal American travel, the realization settled deeper. What they saw was reality, not show. For many prisoners, these first encounters with America were the beginning of an intellectual crisis. Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as a weak, fractured society dominated by greed and materialism. Yet what they witnessed at the docks, in PX stores, and on passenger trains was not weakness, but strength born from abundance. America was not crumbling under the weight of war, it was thriving, producing so much that even its prisoners could glimpse a prosperity unimaginable at home. One prisoner later recalled his astonishment at the train dining car. "I thought we were receiving special treatment, but the guard told me everyone eats like this. I could not believe a farmer and a banker could order the same meal for the same price. It contradicted everything we were taught about class and privilege." In that moment, democracy revealed itself not as a political theory, but as a lived reality. The equality of service, the idea that any man could sit at a counter and order pie and coffee for a few cents, was a social revolution to Germans steeped in hierarchy. By the time the trains pulled into the prison camps scattered across the American heartland, the psychological assault was well underway. These men had not been broken by starvation or brutality. They had been undone by abundance. When the trains carrying German prisoners finally rolled to a halt in the American heartland, the men prepared themselves for harsh captivity. They expected barbed wire, watchtowers, and barracks barely fit for habitation. Those elements were indeed there, but alongside them stood something far more surprising: comfort. The U.S. prison camp system, built rapidly between 1942 and 1945, housed nearly 500,000 Axis prisoners across the country, from Texas to Tennessee, from Minnesota to Arizona. These camps dotted the landscape like small, self-contained towns. They were ringed with fences and patrolled by armed guards. But within the wire, conditions exceeded not only what the Geneva Convention required, but also what many American draftees themselves experienced in training camps. At Camp Crossville in Tennessee, as at dozens of other facilities, barracks came equipped with electric lights, hot running water, and flush toilets. Showers provided hot water daily. Mess halls served 3 meals on schedule. In winter, barracks were heated. In summer, ventilation was adequate by the standards of the day. For German prisoners who had endured the Spartan conditions of desert campaigns and the grueling march of the Eastern Front, this was captivity, unlike anything they imagined. But what truly astonished them was not the infrastructure, it was the abundance of goods available inside the camps themselves. Each facility contained a post exchange, or PX, a kind of miniature department store where prisoners could spend their earnings. Yes, earnings. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be compelled to work, but they had to be compensated. The U.S. military followed this rule strictly. German prisoners received 80 cents per day for labor, later raised to $1. Though paid in coupons rather than cash, these wages allowed them to buy from the PX, and what the PX offered shattered all expectations. Army quartermaster records show that camp exchanges stocked multiple brands of soft drinks: Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, RC Cola. Candy bars lined the shelves. From Hershey to Mars to Nestlé. Where refrigeration permitted, ice cream was available. Cigarettes and tobacco came in abundant supply, along with fresh fruit, snacks, toiletries, and even beer with 2% alcohol content, for men used to empty shelves, ration lines, and Ersatzsubstitutes. The PX was a wonderland. The economics of it were as shocking as the goods themselves. A candy bar cost 5 cents. A bottle of Coca-Cola, also 5 cents. With a day's wage, a prisoner could purchase 16 items. 16 luxuries every single day. In Germany, such items, if obtainable at all, required black market connections or political privilege. Here, they were everyday commodities, within reach even of enemy soldiers. Among all the goods, Coca-Cola emerged as the most powerful symbol. The Coca-Cola Company, under military contract, guaranteed that every American serviceman worldwide could buy a bottle for 5 cents. To meet this commitment, the company produced nearly 5 billion bottles in 1943 alone. Distribution reached even into prison camps. German prisoners quickly realized that this sugary, fizzy beverage was more than just a drink. It was a symbol of industrial democracy, a product so standardized, so widespread, that every American, regardless of rank or wealth, consumed it. Technically minded Germans were astounded by its uniformity. Coca-Cola tasted exactly the same whether purchased in Maine, Texas, or California. The syrup concentrate, manufactured in Atlanta and shipped nationwide to bottling plants. Guaranteed consistency. This level of industrial coordination achieved in wartime no less exceeded anything German industry had managed. It was proof of a system that thrived not on rigidity, but on flexibility and scale. Prison camp records confirm just how much Coca-Cola flowed into the hands of captives. Camp Hearn in Texas, for example, consumed roughly 7,000 bottles per week during the summer of 1943. Across the country, weekly deliveries brought in hundreds of cases per camp, each containing 24 bottles. For many prisoners, the first sip of Coca-Cola was like drinking modernity itself. One later recalled, "My first Coca-Cola was like drinking the future. Sweet, fizzing, unnecessary, and available to anyone for a nickel." That drink contained everything Nazi Germany was not. Oh, ice cream, too, became a recurring delight. Where refrigeration existed, it was sold in bars, sandwiches, and cups for 10 cents apiece. Larger camps ordered between 50 and 100 gallons weekly in summer months. The variety astonished them: vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, butter, pecan, far exceeding what German parlours had offered before the war. Army documents show that ice cream was considered essential to morale. So much so that the Navy even commissioned specialized ice cream ships for the Pacific Fleet. The fact that prisoners could casually enjoy such a luxury while German civilians starved was devastating to their ideology. What began as indulgence soon took on deeper meaning. Prisoners realized that American abundance was not staged propaganda. It was systemic. The same Coca-Cola they drank was also being consumed by American schoolchildren. The same candy bars available in the PX were sold in corner shops across the country. The equality of access, so contrary to German hierarchy, slowly eroded their belief in Nazi superiority. Captivity was still captivity. The fences were real, and so were the guards. But inside the camps, Abundance became a quiet, relentless teacher. Each nickel bottle of Coke, each candy bar, each scoop of ice cream whispered the same truth. In America, prosperity was not hoarded by the few. It was shared by the many. For German soldiers who had marched under swastikas promising victory through sacrifice, this was the most subversive lesson of all. If Coca-Cola had been the first revelation, ice cream and sugar were the lasting shocks. To the German prisoners of war housed in America, these two luxuries embodied the gulf between scarcity and abundance, between a nation straining under total war and a society that could still afford sweetness in every sense of the word. In Germany, sugar was rationed to a mere 280 grams per month per person when it was even available. Mothers hoarded it to stretch across weeks, measuring spoonfuls with anxious care. Cakes and cookies vanished from family tables, replaced by coarse bread and ersatz substitutes. For soldiers, the deprivation was even harsher. On the front lines, sugar was reserved almost exclusively for military priority, leaving most troops with bitter coffee, thin soups, and little else to sweeten their rations. But in American prison camps, sugar flowed like water. Quartermaster records from 1943 to 1945 show that camps received 100-pound sacks of refined sugar every week. In the mess halls, bowls of white granules sat openly on tables. Available for unlimited use, prisoners could scoop spoonfuls into their coffee, sprinkle it on cereals, or stir it into tea. Cakes, cookies, and pies appeared regularly on menus, each slice more indulgent than German civilians had tasted in years. For men trained to treat sugar as precious, the sight was bewildering. Some prisoners hesitated, afraid to use too much. Others heaped spoonful after spoonful into their mugs, testing whether this freedom was real. The supply never seemed to diminish. If bowls ran low, kitchen staff simply refilled them. One incident, documented at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, left a particularly deep impression. In the humid summer of 1943, several hundred pounds of sugar hardened in storage, clumping into bricks. In Germany, such a supply would have been painstakingly steamed and recovered. But in America, the staff considered it too much trouble. They discarded it and ordered replacements. German prisoners working in the kitchen were horrified. To throw away sugar at home, such an act would have been criminal. Here, it was routine. Ice cream delivered an even greater cultural shock. Many prisoners had not tasted it since before the war. In Germany, ice cream parlors had closed as dairy. Sugar and refrigeration vanished under rationing. For soldiers, the idea of ice cream during wartime seemed absurd. Yet in American camps, especially those with electric refrigeration, ice cream was a common indulgence. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the 4th of July celebration of 1943 included hand-cranked freezers producing gallons of the frozen treat. Prisoners watched, wide-eyed, as cream, sugar, ice, and salt were churned together, the final product served in heaping scoops. Later, when electric ice cream makers became standard in larger camps, the process scaled up. By 1944, records show camps ordering between 50 and 100 gallons of ice cream every week during the summer. The flavors astonished them: vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. Butter pecan choices beyond what many had known even in pre-war Germany. PX stores sold ice cream bars and sandwiches for 10 cents. cups of various flavors for the same price. Some prisoners even saved wages specifically to indulge in the frozen luxury once or twice a week. The symbolism of ice cream ran deeper than taste. To Germans raised in a culture where deprivation was equated with strength, the casual use of scarce resources, cream, sugar, refrigeration, even ice in midsummer, was incomprehensible. How could a nation at war afford to waste so much on entertainment food, and yet America did? Not for show, but as a matter of routine. The message was clear. American production was so vast that luxuries could remain commonplace even in wartime. Chocolate compounded the effect. The U.S. military alone purchased £380 million of chocolate products during the war years. Prison exchanges stocked Hershey bars, Mars bars, Nestlé Varieties, and military-issue D-ration bars designed for emergency use. For 5 to 10 cents, prisoners could buy what German civilians hadn't seen in years. They quickly noticed that Americans had preferences. Some liked Hershey, others Snickers, still others Milky Way or Baby Ruth. To the Germans, the very concept of consumer choice in wartime was baffling. The psychological impact was immense. German propaganda had insisted that rationing and sacrifice proved moral superiority, while America's so-called decadence would breed weakness. Yet here were men living the opposite truth, prisoners of war, enemies of the state, enjoying more sugar, more chocolate, more ice cream than free Germans back home. Ideology cracked under the weight of a Sunday dish piled high with whipped cream and cherries. In time, many POWs began to associate ice cream with the essence of America itself. Cold, sweet, excessive. Democratic, it was served to prisoners, soldiers, and children alike. Some later recalled that their first spoonful of American ice cream was as transformative as their first sip of Coca-Cola. It was not simply dessert, it was proof that the American system could produce abundance so effortlessly that even enemies could share in it. For the German POWs, these experiences cut deeper than lectures or re-education programs. Sugar bowls, candy bars, and ice cream cones were not theory. They were taste, smell, memory. Every bite reinforced the same lesson. America's power came not just from its armies, but from its capacity to make luxury into routine. And nothing discredited Nazi propaganda faster than the realization that even as prisoners, they were eating better than their own families at home. The calendar turned to late 1943, and with it came holidays, unlike any the German prisoners of war could have imagined. For men conditioned to expect harsh captivity, the arrival of Thanksgiving and Christmas in America brought not only abundance but an emotional blow to the heart of Nazi ideology. Thanksgiving, an American holiday with no German equivalent, was introduced to the POWs in unmistakable fashion. Army records confirm that every prison camp across the United States served traditional turkey dinners that November: roast turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes and gravy, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, vegetables, pumpkin pie, coffee, and milk. These dishes graced mess hall tables not only for American servicemen, but for their German captives as well. The logistics were staggering, providing holiday meals to nearly 500,000 enemy prisoners while simultaneously feeding millions of UTTs. Soldiers deployed across the globe. Yet the American system accomplished it seamlessly. For the Germans, the meaning was clear. A nation capable of sharing its national holiday feast with enemies while still waging a global war was a nation of resources beyond comprehension. For many, this was the moment when the illusion of German superiority fully cracked. In Nazi ideology, hierarchy and sacrifice defined strength. Yet here was a democracy feeding its prisoners the same meal as its soldiers. Equality at the dinner table carried a message sharper than any propaganda. In America, dignity was not rationed. Then came Christmas, and with it, an outpouring of civilian generosity. Packages began arriving at the camps, not from the military, but from American citizens, church groups, civic organizations, and local families sent gifts to men who, only months before, had been fighting against their sons and brothers. The American Friends Service Committee alone distributed 50,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners in 1943. These parcels contained homemade cookies, candy, toiletries, games, books, cigarettes, and writing materials. Local communities contributed as well. In Tonkawa, Oklahoma, townspeople baked cookies for the Germans at Camp Tonkawa. In Hearne, Texas, church groups delivered candy and cakes. In dozens of small towns, American families extended kindness to the very men their government called enemies. For the prisoners, the shock was not only in the gifts themselves, but in the spirit behind them. They had been taught to expect hatred. Instead, they encountered mercy. Civilians who had every reason for vengeance, families with fathers or sons killed overseas, chose instead to show generosity. This civilian kindness struck deeper than any military ration. It dismantled the very foundation of Nazi racial ideology. The doctrine of superiority thrived on separation, on treating enemies as subhuman. Yet here, German soldiers received homemade cookies from American women, candy from church children, and books from civic groups. They were not treated as inferior beings. They were treated as men. Testimonies years later reveal how profound these moments were. One former prisoner recalled, "At Christmas 1943, I realized the war was truly lost, not because of the guns, but because of the people. A nation that could treat its enemies with kindness possessed a strength we could never match." And the symbolism of holiday abundance extended beyond food and gifts. It was a demonstration of democratic confidence. By including prisoners in celebrations, Americans showed that they had nothing to fear from mercy. Strength was not measured by how much could be taken from others, but by how much could be shared even with those who had once fired weapons in anger. Nazi propaganda collapsed under the weight of such experiences. German officers had promised their soldiers that Americans were cruel, decadent, and incapable of sacrifice. Yet in the camps, those same soldiers carved turkey, shared pumpkin pie, and opened Christmas gifts from strangers who owed them nothing. What argument could stand against the reality of a homemade cookie delivered to an enemy prisoner? Holidays became milestones of transformation. Each year, Thanksgiving and Christmas reinforced the same lesson. Abundance was not the exception in America. It was the norm, and abundance allowed for generosity on a scale that no totalitarian system could reproduce. By the end of 1943, many prisoners no longer saw themselves as enemies enduring hardship. They began to see themselves as students in an unexpected classroom learning, through food and kindness, that the world Nazi Germany promised was a hollow lie. By 1944, the role of German prisoners of war in the United States began to expand beyond the fences of their camps. America was deep into its war effort, and labor shortages grew acute as millions of young men fought overseas. The solution was pragmatic: use POW labor where possible, within the boundaries of the Geneva Convention. For the Germans, This new reality opened an entirely different window into American life, one that would prove even more transformative than camp rations or PX stores. Roughly 100,000 prisoners were assigned to agricultural work, food processing, and other essential industries. Under guard, they travelled from their barracks into orchards, canneries, and fields, encountering firsthand the mechanisms of American abundance. What they witnessed often stunned them into silence. In Michigan, prisoners picked cherries bound for maraschino production, the bright red garnishes topping ice cream sundaes. The sheer volume overwhelmed them. Tons of fruit harvested not for survival rations, but for decoration on dessert. For soldiers from a nation where families subsisted on watery cabbage soup, the idea that entire orchards existed just to sweeten ice cream seemed like satire. At canneries, the astonishment deepened. They watched quality control inspectors reject perfectly edible fruit because of minor blemishes or irregular sizes. These rejects were diverted to animal feed or discarded altogether. Del Monte's 1,944 records show approximately 15% of fruit being rejected during processing. German prisoners, accustomed to scraping mold from bread and boiling potato peels for soup, were aghast. To them, this was not just waste, it was abundance beyond comprehension. Sugar beet processing in Colorado and Nebraska provided another shock. Massive mechanized farms produced more sugar in a single season than entire German regions had managed in years. Tractors, harvesters, and trucks worked in coordinated cycles that dwarfed the manual labor methods still common in Europe. For technically minded POWs, the sight was both awe-inspiring and humiliating. America was not chaotic. It was ruthlessly efficient. Prisoners assigned near schools received yet another education, this time in democracy's youngest generation. Some saw children lining up daily for organized school lunches. Plates carried milk, protein, and vegetables, all served in cafeterias buzzing with chatter. Milk, in particular, impressed the Germans. In their homeland, milk was rationed so severely that many children grew up malnourished. Yet in America, even during wartime, schoolchildren drank it freely every day. Some cafeterias even offered ice cream as an optional treat. The symbolism was inescapable. While German children scraped by on starvation diets, American children licked ice cream cones between lessons. Even more striking were the glimpses of ordinary diners and restaurants, minimum security prisoners, sometimes escorted into towns for labor projects, encountered the heart of American food culture. At these diners, waitresses served hamburgers, Coca-Cola, pea slices, and ice cream sundaes menus that in Germany would have belonged only to elite establishments. Yet here were available to anyone with pocket change. Documented prices from 1,944 highlight the point: a hamburger for 25 cents, a Coca-Cola for 5, a slice of pie for 15, an ice cream sundae for 25, and a full dinner special for 65 to 75 cents. The equality of service shocked the Germans. Bankers and factory workers alike sat side by side at counters, ordering the same meals at the same price. For men steeped in rigid class hierarchies, this simple fact was revolutionary. One prisoner later recalled, "In Germany, a factory worker could never afford to eat like a banker. In America, they sat on the same stool, paid the same price, and were served by the same waitress. It was the first time I understood what democracy looked like. Ugh." These work assignments and observations outside the camps stripped away any lingering illusions. Nazi propaganda had promised that America was decadent and weak, incapable of sustaining a long war. Yet here was a society that could not only sustain it but thrive, feeding its children milk, serving desserts to prisoners, and discarding fruit unfit for canning. Strength was not in deprivation. It was in surplus. The Germans took these lessons back into the camps each evening, discussing them with fellow prisoners. Conversations that once centered on battlefield tactics now turned to marveling at cherry orchards, school milk programs, and the equality of diners. These seemingly mundane details carried more power than bullets or bombs. They showed, in undeniable daily practice, that America's strength lay in the prosperity of its ordinary people. By 1944, many prisoners no longer saw themselves simply as captives. They began to see themselves as reluctant students of a society that contradicted everything they had been taught. Their education came not from lectures or indoctrination sessions, but from cherry orchards, milk cartons, and diner menus. Each observation chipped away at the myth of Nazi superiority, replacing it with the undeniable truth of democratic abundance. By late 1944, the shock of America's abundance was no longer confined to meals, PX shelves, or farm fields. It became quantifiable: newspapers, camp libraries, and even military bulletins published production statistics that revealed in stark numbers what the prisoners were already experiencing with their senses. These figures told a story that no propaganda could obscure. America's capacity for production dwarfed anything the Axis could muster. The numbers rolled in like hammer blows. In 1943, the Coca-Cola company produced nearly 5 billion bottles of soda. In the same year, U.S. factories turned out more than 500 million gallons of ice cream. Milk production soared to £119 billion annually. Chocolate consumption for the military alone topped £380 million. Sugar production, combining cane and beets, reached around 7 million tons per year. For German prisoners who had been taught that America was weak and fragmented, these figures were almost incomprehensible. At first, many suspected exaggeration. But the proof was in their daily lives: the unlimited sugar bowls, the weekly ice cream deliveries, the Coca-Cola bottles in every PX. Numbers on paper matched reality in the mess hall. Meanwhile, German production statistics painted a grim contrast. Sugar was rationed to meagre amounts, 280 grams per month for civilians, when available at all. Meat portions averaged 10 ounces per week, often unavailable due to shortages. Milk was severely restricted. Ice cream was non-existent. Chocolate was hoarded for military priority only. And even then, in small quantities. Soft drink production in Germany barely registered, reserved for elites or propaganda showcases. The disparity was undeniable. German prisoners in American camps were eating better than their own families at home. Daily calorie intake for a prisoner ranged between 303, 600, nearly triple the 200 to 500 calories consumed by civilians in Germany during the same period. Even rationed, Americans complained of sugar restrictions that still gave them 3 times what German families received. The irony cut deeper when the flow of packages reversed direction. Initially, the Red Cross and family parcels had supplied German POWs in America, but by 1944, many prisoners were sending food home instead. Using their PX wages, they purchased chocolate, canned goods, instant coffee, and other non-perishable items to mail to Germany. International Red Cross records confirm that German POWs in America sent roughly 11 million parcels back to their homeland during the war, most containing food. For families in bombed-out cities, these packages from captured fathers and sons became lifelines. They received Hershey bars, coffee tins, canned meat treasures beyond the reach of free civilians. The psychological effect was profound. German families, starving in freedom, survived on the abundance shipped from their imprisoned relatives. One POW later wrote, "I was ashamed to send chocolate home, knowing my children had never tasted it before, but I could buy it in captivity with one day's wage." That sense of shame and the contrast it highlighted cut at the heart of Nazi ideology. What kind of system starved its people while the enemy fed its prisoners? The German High Command could not control these revelations. Letters and parcels arriving in German homes carried undeniable evidence. Mothers opened boxes containing American candy bars, while their cupboards were bare. Children tasted chocolate for the first time in years, learning that it came not from the Reich, but from America, via a father held prisoner. The irony was devastating. Propaganda insisted that Germany was destined for victory. Yet its soldiers had to rely on enemy generosity to feed their families. Even more damaging were the comparative figures openly published in American newspapers, copies of which sometimes circulated in camps. In 1944 alone, American civilians still consumed 74 pounds of sugar per person. Despite rationing, Germans received less than a tenth of that amount. U.S. meat rationing allowed 28 ounces weekly per person, more than Germans received in a month. American children drank milk daily in school, while German children often went months without it. For the German POWs, the statistics confirmed what they already knew in their hearts. They could taste it in every scoop of ice cream, every spoonful of sugar, every casual bottle of Coca-Cola. America's war machine was not fueled by sacrifice and deprivation, but by a torrent of production so vast it spilled luxuries onto the tables of its prisoners. By the end of 1944, many German soldiers no longer saw themselves as merely defeated. They recognized themselves as witnesses to a system fundamentally stronger than their own. They had been taught that scarcity was noble, that sacrifice built character, that deprivation proved superiority. Yet the numbers and the sweetness in their mouths told a different story. America's strength came not from going without, but from producing more than enough for everyone. And in that arithmetic of abundance, the Reich had already lost. By 1945, the tide of war had turned decisively. In Europe, Allied armies pressed into the heart of Germany, while in America, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners waited behind fences, their days filled with labor, food, and a steady erosion of old beliefs. For many, the war had been lost long before their homeland surrendered, lost not only on battlefields, but in PX stores, dining halls, and ice cream parlors behind barbed wire. When Germany finally capitulated in May 1945, the POWs in America entered a new phase of their captivity. Newsreels showed their country in ruins, cities flattened by bombing, civilians reduced to skeletal figures queuing for meager rations, children begging soldiers for food. At the same time, those same newsreels showed American GIs handing out candy bars and chewing gum to those starving children. The contrast was devastating. The Reich that had promised triumph delivered only hunger. The enemy that had been painted as weak and decadent gave chocolate and kindness even in conquest. For the prisoners, the final blow came in the realization that they themselves had lived better in captivity than their families had in freedom. Medical examinations confirmed it. Many returned to Germany healthier and heavier than when they had been captured. Letters from home told of mothers wasting away, children growing thin, and entire communities scraping to survive on a fraction of what American camps provided their captives. By the time they were repatriated between 1945 and 1946, these men carried not only extra pounds but also new perspectives. They had tasted democracy, and it was sweet. They returned with memories of unlimited sugar, ice cream sundaes, Coca-Cola bottles, and Thanksgiving feasts. More importantly, they returned with an understanding that America's strength lay not in cruelty or conquest, but in its capacity to produce abundance and share it even with enemies. Some carried literal proof, using their camp wages. Prisoners had purchased food and consumer goods to send home during the war. They now brought back chocolate bars, tins of coffee, and canned meat, treasures their families treated as miracles. For children who had forgotten the taste of chocolate, these gifts became unforgettable symbols. They also became seeds of transformation, planting in German households the idea that prosperity need not come from conquest. Former POWs became unexpected ambassadors for democracy. Many openly advocated for cooperation with America after the war. They had seen with their own eyes that the United States could afford to rebuild enemies, not just destroy them. When the Marshall Plan was introduced, their voices carried weight. They testified that America's generosity was not a trick. It was real. And it was powerful. The influence stretched into Germany's economic miracle of the 1950 seconds. Men who had once marched under the swastika now worked in factories, businesses, and government offices, applying lessons learned in captivity. They had witnessed the efficiency of American mass production, the discipline of standardization, and the political stability born of consumer abundance. Many became importers of American products, Coca-Cola, chocolate, chewing gum, understanding instinctively their cultural power. Others championed the adoption of American-style supermarkets and distribution systems, recognizing that abundance required more than production. It required accessibility for ordinary people. Personal testimonies illuminate this transformation. One former officer recalled in a 1975 interview, "We expected to defeat a weak, divided America. Instead, we found a nation that could give ice cream to its enemies. That is when we knew we had lost more than a war, we had lost our entire worldview." Another veteran, interviewed for a documentary in 1985, remembered his first sip of Coca-Cola. It was like drinking the future. Sweet, fizzing, unnecessary, and available to anyone for a nickel. That drink contained everything Nazi Germany was not. These testimonies, repeated in memoirs and interviews across decades, show that ideological transformation came not through lectures or indoctrination, but through lived experience. Abundance was undeniable. Sugar could be measured. Chocolate could be tasted. Coca-Cola could be sipped. No speech could compete with the memory of an ice cream cone on a hot summer day in captivity. By the time West Germany rose from the rubble, many of its new leaders carried with them these lessons of abundance and democracy. They had learned that prosperity was not zero-sum, that wealth could be created rather than stolen, and that dignity came not from hierarchy, but from equality. The transformation of German POWs in America became one of the quiet triumphs of the war, a victory not won by bullets, but by butter, chocolate, and Coca-Cola. Looking back, it is easy to measure victory in terms of tanks destroyed, ships sunk, or cities captured. Yet the story of German prisoners of war in America reminds us that the most decisive triumphs can emerge from the simplest of things: a bottle of Coca-Cola, a scoop of ice cream, a candy bar casually discarded by a guard. These men arrived in America as warriors of the Reich, hardened by deserts, indoctrinated by propaganda, convinced of their nation's superiority. They expected cruelty, starvation, and humiliation. Instead, they encountered abundance. They ate 3 meals a day with sugar bowls on every table. They worked in orchards where fruit was discarded for minor blemishes. They saw schoolchildren drinking milk daily and sometimes buying ice cream between classes. They tasted Thanksgiving turkey and opened Christmas gifts from American civilians. Every moment contradicted the ideology they had once believed. Nazi propaganda had promised that America was weak, decadent, and incapable of sacrifice. Yet here was a society waging global war while still producing luxuries in volumes unimaginable. Abundance was not propaganda, it was reality, demonstrated in calories, production statistics, and lived experience. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it universal. Some prisoners clung stubbornly to old beliefs, but for many, the impact was irreversible. They had lived a truth that no speech or leaflet could erase. Democracy could produce not just enough, but more than enough for everyone, even its enemies. Historians like Arnold Kramer have since concluded that food abundance was central to this ideological collapse. American generosity, expressed through sugar, chocolate, and Coca-Cola, accomplished what re-education programs could not. It dismantled myths of superiority and replaced them with lived proof of democracy's strength. The legacy extended far beyond the war. When former POWs returned to a devastated Germany, they carried these memories with them. They became advocates for the Marshall Plan, builders of supermarkets, importers of American goods, and champions of economic policies rooted in abundance. Their children grew up hearing stories that sounded fantastical until West Germany itself rose from the ashes to replicate some of what their fathers had seen in captivity. Today, the influence is visible in everyday life. Coca-Cola is a staple in German stores. Ice cream parlors line city streets. Chocolate bars fill supermarket aisles. These products are more than food. They are symbols of a shift in worldview that began behind American fences in the 1940 seconds. The lesson is timeless. Military victory can defeat armies, but it cannot always change minds. Abundance, however, speaks a universal language. Every man understands hunger and satisfaction. Every child understands the joy of sugar. By feeding their enemies better than those enemies' own governments could feed them, Americans proved a point no ideology could counter. Freedom creates prosperity, and prosperity creates strength. In the end, the greatest weapon America wielded in World War II was not just the Sherman tank or the B-29 bomber. It was the ability to hand a bottle of Coca-Cola to a prisoner for 5 cents, or to serve ice cream on the 4th of July in the middle of the Atlantic. These acts, casual to Americans, were revolutionary to those who received them. One former prisoner put it best: "We arrived believing in German superiority and American weakness. We left knowing the opposite was true. We had tasted democracy, and it was sweet." End. The story of German POWs in America is thus not just a tale of captivity, it is a parable of transformation, a reminder that the most enduring victories are not won through destruction, but through demonstration. By showing its enemies a society where abundance was ordinary, America achieved something no battlefield could guarantee: the permanent shattering of an ideology, the fizz of Coca-Cola. The cold sweetness of ice cream. The simple generosity of a holiday meal, these were democracy's secret weapons. They turned captives into witnesses, enemies into unexpected ambassadors, and skeptics into believers. In the end, the world learned that sometimes the most powerful victories are not forged in steel or fire, but in sugar, cream, and kindness. And so it was that an empire built on scarcity was undone by a democracy that could afford to waste abundance on its enemies. A war won not only with bullets, but with bottles of Coca-Cola.